natives. I have like a note.
I'll bring us to order.
Anything else?
While Karina is doing a little tech work. So welcome to our Monday afternoon seminar for IB. It's my great pleasure to welcome Karina Nielsen, who is in fact a new member of our community as a professor of practice. But more importantly, I think she would agree in all the new director of Oregon Secret. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to invite her to come interact with us more and hang out. A number of you got to talk with her, say at the grad student lunch or in the faculty meeting. And I also want to make sure I say here before I forget, Tara reminded me a couple times, we're having a social right afterward. And I got some drinks and I also got some snacks. So please hang out so we can socialize with Karina a bit more and with each other. I'll do just a brief bio. And I've got my crib notes here. Karina got a BS from Brooklyn College and then went on to do a PhD. Well, not right here, but but in Oregon State University, in our department, in fact, when we were in Formula, working with Bruce Christine. Then went on to do a NSF postdoc, international in Chile, and then came back to work with the PISCO team a little bit more. Then moved on to a faculty position at Sonoma State in the early to mid 2000s, and then transitioned to a position at San Francisco State. From kind of mid 2000s to 2022. And there, she also became the executive director of the Estuary Ocean Science Center. And so has had a really awesome career, doing lots of great things, interacting with people. I also want to point out, she also, emphasizes this in her job talk for Oregon Sea Grant, other life experiences before the marine ecology world entered her radar. Some coursework in things like photography and filmmaking. And serving as a public program assistant at the Brooklyn Center for the Urban Environment. So anyway, I'm going to say no more and let Karina say the rest.
Thank you. Thank you for a very nice introduction. And it's fun to be back in some ways in Oregon, but also to the department that where I earned my PhD. So some familiar faces still here. And even some people who I swapped places with a little bit. I'm looking at my Sonoma State, Oregon State. Anyway, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for welcoming and inviting me for seminar. What I'm going to talk to you about today is some work that I did in transitioning from a fully faculty role and trying to continue a research program while I was also the director of a marine lab in San Francisco on the San Francisco Bay and Estuary. And so it has a lot of flavor of interdisciplinarity and maybe a little bit different from a traditional research talk. So I'll just set the stage like that. And I thought I was going to have time to talk a little bit towards the end about Oregon Sea Grant and the kinds of research that we are typically fund, because there is kind of a sort of a connection to this kind of work that I'm doing here. Not exactly, but there are some pieces of it. But then I put the talk together and realized I was not going to have enough time
For the social.
Yeah, so I'm happy. I talked with some of the faculty about it when we got together, but I'm happy to answer questions and talk about that at another time. So I did my work primarily on the relatively pristine, beautiful outer coast of Oregon, wave exposed, rocky shores, did work in the same habitats in Chile and on the Northern California coast. And then when I took on my role as director of a marine lab, I knew I couldn't go to the field for weeks at a time. It just wasn't compatible with the responsibilities. And so I started to think about what kind of research program could I do that would hybridize some of my interests and things that I did. And because the center is located on San Francisco Bay, a very urbanized, developed estuary, I started thinking a lot about urban ecology, and I had a lot of colleagues who were working in restoration. So I started learning a lot about restoration. So that's kind of how I arrived at this general theme. And in this picture right here, what you can see is kind of a natural rocky shoreline contrasted with a riprap or sometimes we call this generally armored shoreline. Shorelines have been altered to protect from erosion in a very engineered way. with not a lot of nature-based sort of solutions embedded in them. That's San Quentin prison, in case y'all wondering. And then my team down there doing some of the research that we were doing. So that just, there we go. And can I turn this off?
Yeah, you can close it.
Yeah. And I like to start with the thank yous because sometimes I get to the last question screen or something and I sometimes forget, and I don't mean to do that. So the project involved my collaborator, Shayla Zabin from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, a group of very dedicated master's students, my technician, Ryan Hartnett, our youth student, many volunteers, including some community members who supported the work. And then worked together with some environmental engineers from ESA, listed above, and then a technical and planning and design team of advisors. Just to give you a sense of the different folks who work with the State Coastal Conservancy, which is a funding / management / coastal enhancement agency in California, some scientists who work in restoration area, folks who work for the Port of San Francisco who are confronting shoreline sea level rise adaptation planning, so not ecologists, university campus master planners, because at the same time as I was doing this research, we were involved in planning for our campus, which needed some restoration. So folks who are in the design field, who are not familiar with ecology, facilities folks actually ended up being involved, and folks who are involved in CEQA and permitting, and then folks from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, independent nonprofit NGO that does research, and then some colleagues from UCLA and the University of Washington who are involved in similar type of work. So a real diverse group of folks that I have to thank, and then funding from these different groups. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is developing a conceptual design for rocky shore restoration and adaptation plan. And the talk is kind of broken up into 4 sections. I'm going to start by giving you some regional context for the restoration and adaptation and some of the guidance that exists for this urban estuary. I'm going to share some of the ecological research we did to fill some knowledge gaps. We didn't fill them all, but there were some pretty significant ones. And so that was a focus of the research that will be more familiar to many of you. So sort of basic ecological research. But there was also some historical research, some research on other aspects, shall we say, engineering and things like that. But I didn't do my colleagues did. Some of the way we went around working together as a team. So the planning, design, technical team workshops, I'll give you a little sense of the flavor of those. And then a picture of what that restoration design and the climate change application pathways that we came up with for doing the work. So that involved the integration and synthesis of a lot of those different pieces of knowledge. All right, so we'll start with the regional context. So some of you who might be familiar with San Francisco Bay as an estuary, or the larger estuary, which includes the delta, up going up towards the delta, and the Baylands might say, wow, there's an awful lot of soft sediment habitats and marshes, and really, what's up with the rocky shore restoration? And how in the world would you even do a rocky shore, or why do we need to do it? So what I want to do is take you for a minute through a map. A mapping project that was done. It's called Hidden Nature San Francisco, to give you a sense that indeed there have been also rocky shorelines in the bay that have been buried through development or lost through development. So this particular map that's the Golden Gate Bridge going between across the Golden Gate, San Francisco, with the colors on top of it. That is a historical ecology project that has mapped what the habitats were before San Francisco was developed. And it's overlaid on the city itself. And what you can see pretty clearly, right, there are these whole areas here, the city, that are all, filled in, right? So, and then this is that whole, city built on mobile sand dune fields. There's all kinds of interesting stuff about this map. But I'm going to focus on a particular aspect. You can go to that website if you want to explore it. It's fun to play around. So that's the city today. The Bay Bridge is over there. And I made this just a little bit more transparent so you can kind of see through it a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in by the base of the Bay Bridge and superimpose now a historical map from, let's see, it's a US Coast Survey from 1852. And you can see that even though there was some early development, it still wasn't all filled in back then. And if you zoom in even closer, you're starting to get a sense of the topography there, or the edge of the shoreline. This indicates kind of a rocky shore. It's not soft. So, and that's consistent with some photographs we have that confirm that, historical photographs of that area. And I mean, the thing to notice is that it's gone. It's been built over, right? And you can, this is another way of layering a map over. And if you click there, you can get the guide to the habitat type. And it was a spot that looked like this, okay? So steep cliffs, rocky shoreline, yes, some soft, bay beaches, sort of embedded pocket beaches. So that got built over. All right, so that was just by way of hopefully convincing you there's other places I could show you that there are rocky habitats that were often built on top of and then filled out from. So there has been some loss. In San Francisco Bay, the Coastal Conservancy, the Ocean Protection Council, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and the Estuary Partnership and NOAA have collaborated for a long time to develop goals for restoration, for planning, for management. So it's a really different ecosystem from, say, working on the Oregon coast. Like if you want to go do a project, you want to throw a buoy in the bay to measure oceanography, you want to do any restoration, there is like green tape out the wazoo to get permits to do anything. And it's very heavily managed. And if you're proposing to do work that is not consistent with these planning guidelines, good luck. That's step one. So you definitely want to pay attention to those. And the restoration guidance, I'm just going to give you a flavor of what it is like for San Francisco Bay, because normally when you do restoration, you're thinking restoration to prehistoric or pre-anthropogenic impacts. You might have some baseline. As many of you probably know, San Francisco Bay is iconic for being one of the most transformed ecosystems in the world, yet it still has a lot of wildlife and wildlife support and potential. So the guidance for San Francisco Bay, restoration means creating, enhancing, remediating, and rehabilitating habitats. It doesn't mean necessarily bringing it back to some pristine baseline. And it's not intended to do that, in part because there's limited or no data, or the scale of changes have been too large to effectively eliminate them. And this is an artist's imagination of what the Bay might have looked like many moons ago, when grizzlies might have been there actually feeding on whales. And that's not too far-fetched a potential scenario. And the other goal is to improve ecosystem functions and services, and to consider the trade-offs between these ecological benefits or functions and the longevity, efforts, and cost of the restoration. So not just anything goes. Like, is it going to be worth it? And it's an iterative process. So they have a flow chart and a way that they think about how to do things and how to learn from them and how to adaptively manage restoration projects in the Bay. I won't go through all of it, but I just wanted to give you a sense that it's not like one goal and done. And there's a couple of areas of focus that are relevant to the work that I was interested in doing, which was really trying to understand the restoration needs for rocky habitat, and also trying to understand the role of coastal armoring like riprap and seawalls, and whether is that substitute for rocky habitat, is it equivalent, should it be taken out, what are the challenges with that? So one of this is a map of all the hard artificial substrate in the area of San Francisco. You can see there's been a lot added, and especially in the area where you're more likely to have the rocky habitat, which is in this area of San Francisco Bay. A lot of man-made structures, creosote pilings, and there's a whole bunch of science questions or goals that the plan lays out. So things they don't know. There are some really basic things they don't know and that they would like to have to inform restoration going forward. There's mapping of the existing rock habitat that they were able to map. So that doesn't count stuff that's been buried, but you can get a sense that it's concentrated in this area. And there's a bunch of research questions about that. Now, when I came in, I said, well, I know rocky intertidal habitat. Probably some of the stuff we know from the outer coast applies here. But it's very interesting when you're going into a system that is that heavily managed. Folks say, and I kind of like when we were doing conservation and Marine Life Protection Act and Oregon Reserve, Marine Reserve setup, be like, well, but does that really apply here? You know, this is a system so different. And so a lot of the agencies and folks are reluctant to you know, extrapolate, interpolate, or apply theory. They really want to have data on the ground for the system. So there are a lot of basic questions that need to be addressed, and we can always learn from them. So anyway, this was just to give you a sense that that there is a detailed set of objectives out there. And it's pretty progressive in that the way that they want to move forward with restoration or habitat improvement is through integrated projects that include nature-based planning, and that don't just address one habitat or one species at a time, but look at how can we put a mosaic together of different habitats that will elevate the function of that ecosystem and provide connectivity and some of the functions that maybe were compromised or lost. So that's just an image of that frame. And in the foreground, you can see there's eelgrass in the shallow subtidal, rocky intertidal habitats, the conceptual models for living shorelines, which are semi-engineered nature-based solutions that go in, are meant to try and integrate and help connect the habitats from the shore, even the immediate uplands into the water. And one of the big projects that's going on right now is in San Pablo Bay. It's a big pilot project that is integrating all these pieces, but it's focused on marsh and eelgrass bed. There's no reason to consider rocky habitat in this particular place. And the goals are to see if this integrated project can prevent erosion, promote eelgrass growth, carbon storage, habitat for Pacific herring, et cetera, et cetera. And it's based on nature-based planning designs and concepts. And this whole yellow area is sort of the planning area. It's an irregular shape, probably because of the way the permitting is for that particular, and ownership, because it's actually subtidal lands are owned by private ownership in the bay. These are living shorelines and eelgrass plantings that were put out together here. These are marsh plantings and other oyster habitat put out, because one of the goals for San Francisco Bay is to conserve or restore native oysters. Okay. The other thing that happened in 2016, which was very fortuitous, is that a ballot measure was put up for all the counties surrounding San Francisco Bay and said, we need to adapt to sea level rise. We'd like to do restoration work. Will you pay a certain amount on your property tax every year to fund the Restoration Authority to do some of this work? And I'll be darned, they voted it in. And it was really quite, it passed with a 70% majority. It's called Measure AA. And it's a parcel tax of $12 per year. And it raises $25 million annually for 20 years to fund shoreline projects that protect and restore the bay. That's a big, fairly substantial pot of money to do this work. So you can imagine, so there's a San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, so a lot of motivation for people to pick projects to experiment with and to see what they can come up with to actually restore habitats. At the same time, there are private foundations that are funding this work. So the Marin Community Foundation partnered with the Coastal Conservancy and gave them some money and said, we'd like to do some planning and pilot project grants to complement this, to get people ready to apply for the big money. And we'd like them to do that planning work in Marin. And Marin is one of the richest counties in all of California, let alone around the San Francisco Bay. But they have this big foundation, they have money, and the idea is that hopefully those will spark and translate outside. But they were specifically looking for advancing nature-based adaptation solutions. It turns out the Estuary and Ocean Science Center was based in Marin County. So I had a potential pathway not only to do research, but potentially to implement in the future. And when I show you the campus that I worked at, which I will in a little bit, you'll understand why this was very attractive. So here we go. This is the field campus for the Marine Lab at San Francisco State University. It's called the Estuarine Ocean Science Center, and you can see there's a big concrete slab, there's all kinds of armoring. It's a very industrial looking kind of site embedded in a fairly naturalistic peninsula. And it has, I'm not going to go deep into this, I'll touch on it a little bit. It has a long history, and it actually qualifies, and this was part of the work I did when I was there, it qualifies to be listed as a cultural historic landscape. It has national significance, some of the events and the infrastructure and the buildings that are there, but it's a highly modified shoreline. And a lot of the PIs there are working on restoration projects, and a lot of the students are coming there to study that and to work on those projects and to learn about them. And, you know, the spark of idea that I had was, okay, I can do research that's good for my institution, will advance our understanding of restoration in San Francisco Bay, that will actually help maybe some of this, and students could actually work on those projects, and we could learn something in the process. So there was, that was kind of the framework for thinking about how to do it. So I went ahead and applied for one of those Marin Community Foundation grants. We got it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we learned that we needed to know to go forward. But I guess I'll touch, yeah, it's getting warm. I'll touch a little bit on the history of the site. So it's kind of like a case study of the site. And it so happened that I was able to convince the university to do some physical master planning to bring that campus into the university's master plan. I know this sounds really wonky, but like I couldn't fix anything until we had a plan. So even if I'd gotten the money to restore the shoreline, I wouldn't have been able to do it because I didn't have an entitlement to do it at an institutional level. So that was the whole thing that went with it. But the history of the site, just to give you a sense, obviously, pre-colonization, this was the land and waters of the coast Miwok, who lived on the peninsula and fished in the bay and gathered and hunted. Once Europeans came, there were land grants and there were parcels, there was ranching. This was a big fishing operation that was on the cove where you saw that slab. So this is kind of an early image of what it looked like. And then it got transformed, the Navy bought it, got transformed into very industrial site. Eventually it was involved in construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. The north end was highly industrialized. During Second World War, it put up nets for across the ports and harbors for protecting them. And then we all came together to try and figure out how to transform this historic site and the research that we wanted to do to get it into a better state. If you go down on the water's edge, you can see why this is so important. At that north edge where a lot of that infrastructure was, the seawalls are crumbling. There are sinkholes behind the seawall where the water is getting inundated. There are big or catastrophic erosion potential, and there's defunct infrastructure. All of which, if I had my way about it, we would take out and restore to a more naturalistic state. So those were some of the kinds of problems. And I've kind of alluded to this. I co-opted a university administrative plan for the physical campus together with grant funding. And I got the university to agree that what we did with the ecology shoreline restoration planning, which they weren't going to fund, but which was funded, that they would incorporate it into the master plan so that we could actually go forward with it. And that was kind of a big deal. And these are just some of the sketches and things that came out during the planning process. And you can see there's sort of consideration of what would it look like under a sea level rise scenario. Some of the people on the team worked for the San Francisco Estuary Institute, which has been heavily involved in developing an adaptation atlas and adaptation framework for San Francisco Bay. And because we were working with them, our process kind of followed some of their steps. So just in a quick overview, their first step is you assess the vulnerability to sea level rise. within these operational landscape units that they defined. You identify adaptation approaches with a focus on natural and nature-based measures. You have a vision for what you want it to be in the future. You develop your adaptation strategies and then you evaluate your trade-offs and your prioritize where you're going. So, oops, I went backwards. And these are these operational landscape units, so they're defined all the way around, and they have identified opportunities for restoration. And so part of the work we were doing was consistent with this framework, and some of this framework considering the trade-offs and cost. So here's an image that sort of shows the vulnerability to sea level rise. I already showed you some of the crumbling infrastructure, but the as you might imagine, the historic shoreline in red maps onto the projected water level in a very high sea level rise scenario, about 106 foot sea level rise on a 100-year storm surge. So you can see that basically we're going back to reclaim the cove that was there that was paved over. And some of that fill is in jeopardy as well. So that's the vulnerability. Overtopping and flooding is likely to happen sooner. There are other tools and maps that allow us to see where the challenges may be. One of the things that the planners did was to take this image of this northern section of the campus and help us imagine what it would look like with the armoring bond. This was not a real restoration plan. This was just, and at first I was like, oh, but that's so unrealistic. We would never do that exactly that way. But we ended up putting this in the proposal because the planner was like, no, but people need to see what it would look like really different in order for them to understand. And I don't know about you, but when I change those two pictures, I feel different when I look at that shoreline. It just feels better, right? There's a little bit of this, it's a calmer feeling place. It looks like a place you'd like to go hang out. So we defined a project area, we defined reaches and defined sort of what the problems and the issues were in the different areas, and came up with, just looking at what, this is just to give you a sense of the infrastructure we were dealing with. It's pretty bad. This is in front of this lab. There's pilings out in front, which potentially could get repurposed, but there's this really hard seawall, creates a lot of high wave energy. A lot of creosote pilings that are not good, just massive infrastructure there. So what would you do? You wouldn't just like take it all out, blow it all up and put gravel in that picture. You would want to say, well, what were the habitats like around the bay? What functions are missing that we could put in? And so we decided to do research on, okay, what do natural rocky shorelines look like and function like today? What do some of these artificial habitats look like and function like? What species are there? What are their abundances? How are they connected to other parts of the food web? And the one of the things that was important to consider was, are things like riprap, if properly engineered and designed, are they that different from a rocky shore? Maybe they're not that bad. Are they like a cobble beach? Maybe we don't have to go all out and just blow everything up and recreate rocks and things like that. So really starting to think about that. So there was this limited amount of data for the area. So we took that study area. We decided to study 20 field sites around the Bay Area with kind of a focus on the Tiburon Peninsula, which is where the site where we wanted to implement the work was going to be. But we wanted to put it in a regional context. So those are the 20 sites around San Francisco Bay. And we went ahead and did traditional field surveys. We did use shore normal transects. So there's those transects that are going across the entire width of the intertidal. Kind of like Pete Ramundi's group, the point intercept sampling along them to get cover and species richness and all that kind of stuff. We also did quadrat sampling in the mid and the low zone to get more detailed look at things. Along each of those transects, we sampled anywhere between 50 and 100 points times 5. So pretty comprehensive mapped out look at those shorelines. So these are some natural rocky benches in San Francisco Bay to give you a sense of what they look like. What do you see there, Bruce? Fucus and ulva, right? A lot of fucus and ulva. There's some other stuff there too. And then cobble beaches in between these sort of headlands. So you get these rocky peninsulas, and then you get these cobble beaches, and sometimes you actually get bay beaches with sand. And so there's sort of a complex. It's not just a rocky shore. And those pieces interact and have different species assemblages. And then these are some examples of the riprap shore. The thing about the coastal armoring and trying to get similar sites is they're all really different. A lot of them are kind of unique solutions. Some of them are steeper, some of them use different kinds of rocks, some of them are more engineered, some less engineered. So it's a little bit hard to generalize sometimes about them. And then seawalls. We wanted to look at seawalls and see what grows on them. There aren't that many that are accessible in the intertidal zone where you can stand and do the surveys easily. But we were able to find a few, and you can see they come in different flavors. Some of them are pretty smooth. Some of them have these steps in them. Some of them really have steps in them. And they have brick, provide a lot of rugosity and habitat. Again, a little hard to compare, but they have some things in common. Very vertical. This was an interesting contrast case, just because we know that rugosity can tend to provide a lot of microhabitats. And then you might think, okay, well, what are the functions these habitats might, what's so important about these rocks, the seaweeds on them? Well, so here's a boulder and gravel strewn beach in Tiburon. Well, these beaches and this habitat in exactly this area that we were surveying is the hotspot for Pacific herring spawning. And they spawn on eelgrass and macroalgae, and fucus is one of the substrates that they will spawn on. And so it's very important essential fish habitat for this species. So it has an important habitat goal, wildlife support. It's so important that when there's oil spills, just like there was in the Exxon Valdez, we get lots of people coming in to kind of clean up all this fucus. So it has high conservation value. And so there is a role for conserving it, protecting it, and trying to restore it. So, and then in addition, so here's the fucus is dried out at low tide. This is a hot day. What about these cobbles? What's under them, I think, is what's important. Native oysters. So a lot of them tend to settle on the undersides of these cobbles, depending on how stable they are. If they're small and the wave energy is high, it might not be such great habitat. So there's sort of a dynamic relationship with the setting. And then of course, there's all kinds of isopods and other things under there, but the native oyster is of conservation concern too. And then, as I said, some of these natural beaches actually have a veneer of sand. They get rack lines, and there's all kinds of amphipods and other insects that are coming to feed and decompose. So there's some nutrient cycling that's going on and providing fish food and bird food. So this is wildlife support in some ways. And then the other thing is to notice that when you have a natural shoreline and connectivity, those bluffs and cliffs, you have a more natural sediment dynamic and supply in and out of the bay. And some of our colleagues have done work up in the Salish Sea showing that when you get systems that are heavily armored, you actually change the sediment dynamics of the whole ecosystem. So this is something of concern too, is just the physical habitat impedance of armoring. Okay. And then, there we are doing our surveys, and that's a fishing spot, and people are catching a brown rockfish. And we have surveys from the Tiburon lab where the brown rockfish have stomach full of amphipods and isopods and the kinds of things that are living on a lot of this seaweed. So we're pretty clear on that. There are lots of birds that forage. And one of my an REU student who worked with me just was curious about this after she saw, the fishes and learned about what they fed on, and did a quick survey on the abundance with tidal height in fucus of amphipods and isopods. And, we documented maybe not a shocking pattern, but it's nice to know that just if you have fucus in the low zone, you're going to have a lot of these crustaceans available. As I said, we did this big survey of cover across all those sites. And this little drawing here is to try and help orient you. The order of sites on the bottom here follows this trajectory around the bay, okay, from left to right, just to give you a sense of where you are in space. This is the cover of the sessile taxonomic groups that we identified, and there's a lot of detail in this, but what you can see is that there's several species of brown that show up, green seaweeds, macroalgae that show up, several species of the brown macroalgae that show up, mostly fucus, a large group of red seaweeds, so a fairly diverse assemblage of red seaweeds that show up. And most of these, not all, but most of them are native species. A lichen, there are several lichens that are in the upper littoral zone. Barnacles tend to make up a fair amount of cover. The oyster and mussel beds do not, unless you're like looking underneath, right? And the mussels are in cracks and crevices. They don't form beds as they might in outer intertidal habitats. There's no super strong pattern in cover. Basically, algal cover is dominant. Ulva, fucus, and mastocarpus are the three types that you tend to see, and there is some barnacle cover at most sites. So that, if you wanted to kind of just get an impression, what's the cover, that's kind of what it's made up of. There's just some photographs of them. And in general, the marine macroalgae, this is a study from 1977, marine macroalgae penetrate up into San Francisco Bay, primarily in this area. You start getting mostly eelgrass, bluegrass area, but things start to peter out as you go further away. So this is consistent, this is clearly an area where you have a lot of marine influenced macroalgae and habitat. Same thing, this is the order of the sites, left to right, and looking at the abundance of rockweed and in the mid zone and the low zone, and just using a different method, the quadrats, to get a different look at it. Clearly there is pretty prevalent cover in the mid zone. It falls out in the low zone. You get cover in places where the riprap has been put in and extends the hard substrate into the low zone. So that's probably not a very natural pattern. And one of the interesting things you'll notice is that the oysters have a spatial sort of area that they tend to hang out in more. It's not that there aren't oysters at these other sites, there are, it's just that they are very prevalent in this region. And in fact, we didn't study this site up here, but the NER program has, and they that is one of the places of highest density of oysters in all of San Francisco Bay. So this area is important oyster habitat, but mostly as you get further away from the mouth. So that's important to know. We wanted to look at the abundance of these two, species of concern, if you will, or focal species on the different shoreline types. We did this comparison. Basically, what you learn is that rockweed cover is highest on natural rocky benches and on riprap shores. And that's higher than you would see in the cobble benches. And it can reach high cover, as I just said, if low zone, if you have riprap. And that native oyster density is greatest in the low zone, but it's pretty similar across these different habitat types. So pretty equally good. We also did experiments to see, well, if you were going to restore, we often saw oysters underneath algae. Would it be better to kind of co-plant them together, like take oyster spat in to get them started and put fucus side by side? And so we did experiments where we looked at survivorship of juvenile oysters in clusters, either under fucus, so this is what it looked like underneath, or in areas where we cleared the fucus, but there had been fucus or rockweed, and we put in, we glued them down with Z-spar. And one of the things you can see is that actually this shows that these are all oysters on the half shell. There's nothing there. They've been eaten, and these oysters are still intact. A little hard to see from the picture, but the gist of it is, and this you might have predicted from basic ecology, but it's good to confirm, oyster survival is greater in the low zone than the high zone, presumably because of stress, but there was an added effect that the rockweeds benefited their survival. So in practice, on another project, at that giant marsh site where they have these big oyster reefs out, they've started co-planting, starting oysters and fucus together. And the fucus is actually helping the survivorship and the establishment of oysters on those reefs. So we've already kind of put the results of this study into play, but it's a good thing to know. In addition, if you're going to engineer these rocky shorelines and think about taking out riprap, maybe creating surfaces to restore on, it would be good to know what angle should, this is what the engineers want to know, how steep should it be? Does it matter? And so we had an opportunity to use, this was sort of a serendipitous, this is all artificial riprap. These are these blocks they used as weights for the nets in the Navy days, pull down the submarine nets. And somebody made this unengineered riprap, basically. But what was cool about it as a system, there's fucus all over these. And we were able to take advantage of measuring the density of fucus on each of the sides, taking the angles of each of those surfaces, and trying to understand what kind of surface, what kind of angle, what kind of wave exposure, what kind of orientation favored the fucus populations. And the tops of these blocks that have a slight angle to them tend to be where you get the highest density. You get more in the mid zone than the low zone. The backs tend to be good. The fronts are terrible. And there's some good biology around why you would expect that to happen given their orientation. But we learned something about what kinds of substrates might be good. We also wanted to look specifically at the angle. So we looked at it two ways. We looked at the number of rockweed thalli as a function of the angle of the block surface. And you can tell that as it gets steeper, you tend to get fewer or lower densities. And then we also looked at how much fucus do you get? What's the width of the fucus habitat based on the steepness of the angle of the shoreline? And you have to have pretty low angles as you start getting steeper, you start to lose it. So these are good pieces of information. And this work, I should mention, was done by the REU student Daniela Barcelo Rosario and Elizabeth Max, two of the students. So this was work that they presented at the San Francisco Estuary conference. We also looked at the width of the fucus zone and how it varied among the different habitat types. There was almost no seaweed zone on the seawalls. You get a few, but these three habitats were pretty similar in terms of width overall. All right, so those were some knowledge gaps about some key species that were of interest for restoration that we were able to collect information on and then apply in the designing, right? So we know it's not critical that we take all of the artificial habitat out. It might be critical that we modify the steepness, that we put in rugosity. We learned a number of things that are going to be useful for the planning and the design work. This was the team coming together. So we had planning charrettes and then we had design workshops. And this is the same group of folks I showed you earlier, but these were very interactive and we had to explain what we meant to each other, people from different fields. It was a very interesting and stimulating experience. We all learned a lot from each other.
What's a charrette?
A charrette, thank you for asking. A charrette is a fancy name that architects and designers and planners use to bring people together to kind of design, to share information, sketch out ideas, provide feedback to each other, identify priorities. It's kind of like a workshop, but it's not a design workshop where you're literally designing, you're kind of putting up some ideas and getting feedback. And you take that and you put it into, you get folks who are, can actually draw sort of different ideas based on that feedback. And then you draw that and then you use that to move the proposals forward. Yeah, I didn't know what that meant a long time ago. And so we went forward with this side-by-side planning. We had done some of the data collection for the restoration work, and the master planning work was continuing for the whole campus, not just the shoreline. And this is really a unique thing. University campus planners don't usually talk to ecologists. Environmental engineers might to some extent, depending on the problem, but they're not usually designing a kind of innovative shoreline restoration, they're usually trying to keep costs down, and just build the function. So this was kind of an interesting and challenging process. This, to just cut to the chase, this was kind of a final preferred conceptual drawing for the campus itself, with some hint of some restoration possibilities here, but this was just because they knew we were planning something. It wasn't specific. The environmental engineering firm that we worked with and taking the information out of the planning charrettes and into design phase came up with some of these ideas. So this idea here is there's a big watershed and a lot of water that comes in here. We know that the sea level rise is going to inundate in this part. The idea was to take out the infrastructure, create extend this beach, and maybe create an area of wetland here with bay appropriate plants and thinking about the conditions that would be there. The other thing was this area here, which had riprap. We decided not to undo it because we learned that underneath there were a lot of things that we might not want to uncover. It was kind of a Navy dumping ground. So there's a lot of metal. There might be some things there that would be better left covered. So the idea here is to modify the riprap, to make it less steep, to make it accessible, and to create a transition from sort of a built landscape to this more natural restored area here. The idea here is to create a beach bounded by rocky headland habitat that could be created from materials on site. Some of those blocks could be restructured or cemented or molded into more naturalistic features and allow there to be a beach here. And the idea was to create the same kinds of headland features here, take out the armoring and let natural processes create a pocket beach here. So some ideas that started to get expressed on paper, which seem far-fetched, but here's a potential vision of what it might look like. The idea was that the slab and the marine lab, this marine lab, most of the research is here. The idea is that actually between inundation and sea level rise, this place is just right in the watershed pathway, and the idea is to eventually relocate the buildings out of harm's way, to some extent hold the line a bit on the slab because it's functional. But let the watershed reconnect to there. We also explored the idea of putting in enhancements to the seawall, which we would not be taking out because of its function, and it's not cost effective. So how can we provide habitat there? And using some of the ideas for the Seattle seawall project that was done, by creating light surfaces that allow light to penetrate, and so there were some ecological enhancements there. So this is what some of these seawall enhancements kind of look like in reality. They provide spaces for critters, and there's some rationale for how they might work. I talked to you about this already, just a little close-up of that beach and what it could look like. And so this is the conceptual design phase. So this is where we landed, and the idea is that we would be doing restoration and sort of actively trying to establish fucoids and oysters, and maybe it would look something like this one day, with a little bit more natural shoreline here, a transitionary space that people could use. It would be more accessible depending on your mobility, and to be able to come down and experience the beach, a trail up here. Campus. Now, the last phase of this was, well, you can't do this all at once. This is massive, right? Like massive project. So one of the things we also did was to figure out what do you do first, second, third, and where are the places where you might change your mind as things go on, depending what happens. So part of the plan was to make kind of create adaptation pathways. So these are kinds of things, maintain the university operations on the slab. Delta Hall, that research building will eventually be moved. This is where we want to hold the line in terms of trying to keep things intact. And sort of, you could go this way first, or you could go this way first. This would precede this. So they're just sort of different ways you could proceed depending on how much money you have, what the capacity is. But that would at every step sort of enhance the adaptation protection of the assets behind and create habitat. And this was for the North Reach. So there were just sort of two different plans that we did. It was a lot of information, a lot of like not just science, but how do you integrate some of the science and the planning? Do we learn everything we need to know to restore and to understand these habitats? No. Did we learn enough to sort of make some initial decisions and some understanding of the habitat and what we might be providing support for in the restoration? Yes. So this is iterative, a small grant. We did provided a lot of information of value to San Francisco Bay because nobody had been studying the rocky habitats except for after the oil spill when they were cleaning up the the fucus for the herring spawn. So there was a body of work now with initial baseline data that people can build on, and that there's actually recognition that the rocky habitat is important, not just the soft habitats. The work together on co-developing these designs and this planning, although maybe seems a little outside of our area of expertise or comfort zone, it prompted conversations with people who don't usually think about climate change or climate change adaptation, who work in different disciplines or different parts of the university. And I view that as a really important science engagement piece of the work. They got to hear from us in part of their work and learn how important it was. And so there's a big communications piece to this work. It also allowed us, especially at the university where I was, San Francisco State had a very big premium on environmental justice. We talked a lot about the value of having this place for the communities who were attending on the main campus, the undergraduates, finding a way to find a place for them to come out and enjoy this amazing property and to actually be able to do research and you know, it's just over the bridge. It's not, you know, a 3-hour trip away from their main campus. So there were lots of interesting conversations that happened, and then honoring Coast Miwok and like, what could that be in terms of part of the restoration. So the next steps now that I've left at university is that I've left a plan and I've left some data, and my colleague who took over is actually working on it. Just asked for the plan today. They're continuing to work and sort of they're in this phase. How do we get the plan refined? How do we evaluate those trade-offs and prioritization strategies? And then really importantly, how do we go convince the Restoration Authority to give us money to do this project? But this sort of sets that stage for doing that well. So I'd say those are the sort of 3 takeaways from that project, and how I think this is sort of how I combined an administrative leadership job, which didn't have a lot of potential for research, with my research work in a creative way that kind of made a contribution that I think was substantive, but allowed me to mesh these different aspects of my job, which was not a typical sort of R1 kind of research job. So I thought that might also be of interest to some folks. So how we can do that. And with that, thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions. Questions for Karina? Yeah.
Okay, so the oysters.
Yeah.
So when you started to talk about the oysters, I thought that the goal was going to be just to have some sort of fishery.
Oh, like oyster fishery.
Yeah, but
Not with the water
clearly that
quality of
doesn't-
San Francisco Bay.
Right.
Sure.
So I was thinking, wow, I didn't even know oysters. So that's clearly not what the goal is.
It's just conservation of the
It's just
species,
like restoration of the, okay.
basically.
And is that oyster, is it limited to, is it endemic to the bay, or I don't know?
It's endemic to the west coast, the US, and in bays and estuaries. The populations are declining. They were exploited. And then non-native oysters were cultivated in the bay, and then the water quality got bad, and then they stopped cultivating oysters. And there are some places you know, where people think there were abundant native oysters, but because they were so heavily exploited when Europeans came, they crashed. And so there is an interest in restoring them.
Okay, and then last question.
Yeah.
About the oysters. So then was another goal to, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's right, because they're not very abundant, but was like in functioning and sort of water quality, or that it's really just about biodiversity.
It was really, really about biodiversity conservation, the functioning of the seaweeds in terms of nutrient uptake, maybe locally. San Francisco Bay is so large and there's so much water running through it that that fringe is not going to make a significant. It'll make maybe some local impacts, but not at the scale of the bay. Yeah, so it's a scaling problem there.
There's a question. It says, I was wondering how were you able to keep yourself grounded and focus on such large scale projects? And thank you for the amazing presentation.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. How was I able to keep myself grounded and focused on such large scale projects? I don't know, because it was fun. It was interesting because I had a great team who helped work with me because I was working with other people. I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit of a personal headspace thing. It gave me joy because it wasn't, it kept me in touch with research. It kept me working with students. It kept me in touch with sort of why I first became a scientist, right? And that brought me some joy to, work that is important, director work, chair work, but can be soul crushing also sometimes. Yes.
So it sounds like you actually found like kind of a number of natural experiments, right? You found like the like angle. You also found like the different types of seawall. I don't know. Do you have like any other intuition about like other things that you found around the bay that, because it sounds like those are like projects that take like years for like enterprise graduate student or something like that. Did you like, I don't know, was there anything else that you like noticed about, especially like some of the things that it sounds like humans have just kind of done some mishmash anyway that like was interesting about the habitat or anything like that?
I mean, I was finding the rack lines and these little bay beaches that had all this natural history and function that I only ever saw on like outer beaches and didn't think was there was kind of cool, right? Like I was like, oh, they're here and they're doing the cycling and the birds are coming. If I sit quietly, there were times where I would just go and sit quietly and see how many birds came. And that was cool. And the thing that was interesting, it wasn't all shorebirds and birds that you would expect. There was one spot where it was feeding, like the starlings were feeding in the intertidal zone. So that was weird, but fun.
Destroy that spot.
But then there were also, herons that would be hunting. There was a crow that came and picked up a crab and dropped it on a rock like a seagull would. So there were a lot of these interesting things with city critters, if you will, or more urbanized critters they were doing that was different. And I think one of the things that was challenging for me, and I didn't have a time to really frame it up this way in this talk, was, there is a whole field of urban ecology and terrestrial. There is a whole set of scientists studying armoring and invasive species and sort of the different species richness on armored versus non-armored. There really isn't, there's a few people who are starting to try and frame up questions around urban marine ecology. But there's only a few people really doing it. Some people call it ocean sprawl. And thinking about industrialization, the oceans and like what we learned. So I think there's a nice theoretical framework that, if I had stayed there doing that work, I was hoping to kind of help contextualize some of this work in a broader context so that it could be more broadly applicable in other places. So I think there are sort of the sparks of that field emerging. And I think that would be a neat thing to build on. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your great work. I wonder if you can share for our students the skill sets that you developed as a grad student here that you found was most important to your ability to lead large multifaceted projects like this.
Okay, what came to mind first was my memory of starting my dissertation project in Boiler Bay. It was a really big project. I had a lot of pools. I was trying to measure a lot of things. I was bringing back a lot of samples that needed to be sorted through, and I needed help. I couldn't do it all by myself. And so I figured out how to recruit students to help with the project. But I don't know if you remember, Bruce, I mean, some of us, there were times when I had quite a few undergrads who were working for credit. And then they would come out to the coast with me. And so like learning how to organize them and make sure they could be productive and helpful and maybe answer a small question on their own, like doing that, I would say when I was a grad student, that was one piece. What else? Well, the first few years I was in grad school, I hardly talked. I was like terrified. You know, I'm not lying. I think my first year I was never as quiet. I didn't recognize myself because I was really intimidated by all smart people around. I will say, I think a piece of it, I'm sorry, I'm gonna compliment you, Bruce, and Jay, like the really supportive environment that you created, even when I was quaking in my boots, that helped me understand how to be a good mentor and how to help people do well. It took me a while to find my footing and to feel comfortable, but I didn't run away because people were telling me I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do, or were insulting me because I was nervous and I wasn't speaking, I wasn't ready to really communicate. You can hear me, I'm a chatty person, like, but I was really intimidated when I started grad school. So I would say, I think, those two things, and then just having experience leading groups of students was really helpful. I hope that addressed your question. Yeah.
First of all, I'm sorry. I if I contributed to the.
You didn't.
Okay. Frankly, I don't remember.
Students and the postdocs, so I was like, whoa, I come nowhere near as smart as these people. I had the whole imposter syndrome. I didn't even know what it was.
Being so quiet.
I made up for it.
Yeah. And I want to point out to the audience that Karina, for her PhD, did one of the most awesome experiments I've ever seen. So at Boiler Bay, she wanted to study what was colonizing tide pools and see what effect nutrients had on those and what effect herbivores had on them and so forth. But the tide pools weren't all the same size. They were very variable in size. So she went to Portland and rented a gas-powered jackhammer. And she went down to the rocks and she jackhammered out her own tide pool. And there were like
84.
And if anybody's been to Boiler Bay, getting down there is not easy. Especially if you got a jackhammer.
I had a rope. I had a good rope.
Anyways. They are. It was a classic study.
Thank you. It was, well, look, how could I have felt that I could do it? I mean, you guys, anyway, you provided the right environment so that I could do it. Yeah. We did talk about various tools. No, you're right. And it was my sculptor friend. I had a friend who was a sculptor, and he came out to visit that summer when I was first starting. I started with hammer and chisel because Peter Van Tammelen picked into that. And I was like, oh, this is never going to get done. It was sedimentary rocks. It wasn't like basalt. It wasn't super hard, but it was tedious and painful. And I wasn't going to get 84 tide pools done. And my friend was there, and he's a conceptual artist and sculptor, and he said, oh, you need a jackhammer and you need a form. And so he helped me think about how to build something. And he came down and helped me. He came down and kind of helped me one day. And so I said, my solution came from a friend who was an artist who just had a different way of thinking about, how to solve a problem. So yeah, I think that's kind of thing.
All right, folks, I'm gonna say this is a good time to transition to the patio. Got drinks, got food, come join us.